A useless old woman shouldn't even be sitting at this table, my daughter-in-law said, her voice light, almost playful, as if she were making a harmless joke. But the way the room fell quiet told a different story. The crystal glasses stopped clinking. The soft hum of polite conversation dissolved into a silence so thin I could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights. I sat there, at my son Daniel's wedding reception, in a navy blue evening gown I had chosen weeks ago with careful hands, and I smiled. Not because it was funny, not because it didn't hurt, but because in that exact moment, I understood something they didn't know I understood. The ballroom was everything Chloe had dreamed of. White roses cascading from tall centerpieces, gold-trimmed linens, a live quartet playing softly in the corner. It was the kind of wedding people would talk about for years, the kind that whispered money without ever saying the word out loud. I had paid for most of it, quietly, without ever asking for recognition. That had always been my way. Give, support, step back. Let them shine. And yet, here I was, reduced to a punchline in front of 200 guests. I could feel eyes on me. Some sympathetic, some curious, some pretending not to notice at all. Daniel stood beside his bride, his hand resting lightly on her back, his expression frozen in that polite, practiced smile he'd learned over the years. He didn't correct her. He didn't even look at me. That was the part that settled deepest, like a weight in my chest. Chloe lifted her champagne glass, laughing softly as if she had said something clever, something charming. A few guests chuckled, unsure, following her lead. I raised my own glass in return, my hand steady, my smile calm, and took a slow sip. The champagne tasted dry, almost bitter, but I didn't let it show. I had spent 72 years learning how to hold myself together in rooms exactly like this. How to sit through discomfort without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing me break. But this wasn't just about a careless remark. It never is. Moments like these don't appear out of nowhere. They grow quietly, fed by smaller things people choose to ignore. A dismissive glance. A conversation that stops when you enter the room. Decisions made without asking you, even when they involve your own life. I had seen those signs before. I had simply chosen to believe they didn't mean what they clearly meant. Around me, the music resumed, soft and elegant, as if nothing had happened. Servers moved gracefully between tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates, maintaining the illusion that everything was perfect. Chloe leaned into Daniel, whispering something that made him nod, still not meeting my eyes. I watched them for a moment, really watched them, and felt something inside me shift, not break, not shatter, but settle into place. A quiet clarity. Because while everyone else in that room believed I had just been humiliated, I knew something they didn't. I knew why I stayed silent. And more importantly, I knew what would happen next. The reception continued as if nothing had happened, but something in the air had changed, something subtle yet unmistakable, like the shift in temperature before a storm. I remained seated at my table near the center of the ballroom, the one labeled family, though the word felt strangely misplaced now. The white linen tablecloth was smooth beneath my fingertips, untouched except for the place setting in front of me, which I had barely used. My plate still held most of the meal, the filet mignon growing cold, the asparagus untouched, the small gold-rimmed dessert fork resting exactly where the server had placed it. Across the room, laughter rose and fell in practiced waves, the kind of laughter that belonged in photographs and highlight reels. People were smiling, toasting, leaning in close to one another as if this were the most perfect evening they had ever attended. And perhaps, for them, it was. I watched Chloe as she moved from table to table, her white gown catching the light with every step, her smile flawless, her posture effortless. She knew how to command a room. She always had. When she laughed, people joined in. When she spoke, they listened. It was a talent, one I had once admired. Now, I saw it for what it truly was. Daniel followed just a step behind her, not leading, not quite beside her, but always within reach, as if tethered by something invisible. He nodded when she spoke, smiled when she smiled, and never once looked in my direction. Not once. I lifted my glass again, though I had not intended to drink, and let the cool rim rest briefly against my lips. The champagne had lost its sparkle by now, much like the illusion I had held onto for far too long. 2 tables over, I noticed a pair of women leaning toward each other, their voices low, their eyes flicking toward me before quickly looking away. I did not need to hear their words to understand them. Pity has a way of traveling without sound. I set my glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, a small act of control in a room where everything else felt carefully orchestrated by someone else. The band shifted into a slower melody, something soft and sentimental, and the lights dimmed just slightly, casting a warm glow over the dance floor. An announcement followed, inviting the bride and groom to share their first dance. Applause filled the room, enthusiastic, expected. I joined in, my hands moving together in quiet rhythm, my expression unchanged. Chloe rested her head lightly against Daniel's shoulder as they began to sway, and for a moment, the room seemed to belong entirely to them. I studied my son's face as he looked down at his bride. There was affection there, certainly, but something else as well, something more hesitant, more uncertain, like a man who had already agreed to something he could not fully take back. It was subtle, easy to miss, but I had spent a lifetime reading him. I did not miss it. A server approached my table, offering to refresh my drink, but I declined with a small shake of my head. My voice, when I finally used it, was calm, steady, almost detached as I thanked him. He nodded politely and moved on, unaware that he had just witnessed the only words I had spoken since that moment earlier in the evening. Silence can be mistaken for weakness. That is a common misunderstanding. In truth, silence is often a choice, and choices, when made with clarity, carry a kind of strength that does not need to announce itself. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing myself a clearer view of the entire room. The guests, the decorations, the carefully planned sequence of events, all of it unfolding exactly as intended. Exactly as Chloe had designed. But there was something she had not accounted for, something no one in that room had considered. I did not come here unprepared. And while they celebrated what they believed was the beginning of their perfect life together, I sat quietly, knowing that before the night was over, the story they were telling themselves would begin to change. I had learned long ago that the truth rarely announces itself in loud, dramatic moments. More often, it reveals itself in the quiet spaces between words, in the things people assume you will not notice. As the music carried softly across the ballroom, I let my gaze drift, not aimlessly, but with purpose. Chloe's parents were seated near the front, speaking with a group of guests I did not recognize, their expressions polished, their laughter measured. They looked comfortable, as if they had always belonged in rooms like this. I wondered, not for the first time, how much of tonight had truly been about celebrating a marriage, and how much had been about securing something else entirely. A few weeks ago, I might have dismissed that thought. I might have told myself I was being unfair, that I was reading too much into things. But a few weeks ago, I had not received that phone call. It had come on a quiet afternoon, just after 3 o'clock, while I was sitting in my living room with a cup of tea growing cold beside me. The voice on the other end had been calm, professional, and careful with every word. He introduced himself as someone who had worked with my late husband many years ago, someone who had kept an eye on certain matters out of respect, not obligation. At first, I almost ended the call, assuming it was nothing more than a delayed courtesy, but something in his tone made me pause. He asked if I was aware of recent changes being discussed regarding my property. Not suggested. Not considered. Discussed. I remember sitting a little straighter in my chair, the silence stretching between us as I chose my next words carefully. I told him I was not aware of any such discussions. There was a brief pause, the kind that carries more meaning than any explanation, and then he said something that settled heavily in my mind and has not left since. He said that sometimes, the people closest to us make decisions long before we are invited to the conversation. After that call, I began to notice things differently. Documents left briefly unattended on the kitchen counter when Daniel and Chloe visited. Conversations that stopped a second too late when I entered the room. A shift in tone when finances were mentioned, subtle but consistent. At the time, I did not confront them. I did not ask questions. I simply watched, listened, and remembered. Back in the ballroom, Chloe twirled slightly as the music guided her movements, her dress catching the light in soft, shimmering waves. Applause followed as the song came to an end, and Daniel guided her gently back toward the center of the room. The master of ceremonies stepped forward again, announcing the next part of the evening, his voice warm and practiced. Speeches would begin shortly. I felt a faint stir of anticipation ripple through the guests, a collective shift as people adjusted in their seats, turned their attention forward, prepared to listen. I rested my hands lightly in my lap, my posture relaxed, my expression composed. From the outside, I imagine I looked exactly as expected. A quiet, aging mother, content to sit on the sidelines while the younger generation took their place at the center. That assumption has always been useful. It allows people to underestimate you without hesitation. And when people underestimate you, they rarely see what is coming next. I glanced once more toward Daniel, just briefly, long enough to see the tension he was trying to hide beneath his calm exterior. He knew something was not quite right, even if he had not yet admitted it to himself. Chloe, on the other hand, looked completely at ease, her confidence unshaken, her smile as effortless as ever. She believed she was in control of the evening, of the narrative, of the future that was being quietly arranged behind the scenes. I folded my hands together gently and took a slow, steady breath. The speeches were about to begin, and with them, the first crack in that carefully constructed illusion would finally appear. The master of ceremonies adjusted his microphone with a smooth, practiced motion, his smile broad as he welcomed everyone's attention toward the center of the room. The gentle hum of conversation faded once more, replaced by an expectant quiet that settled over the tables like a soft blanket. I remained still, my hands folded lightly in my lap, as the first speaker was introduced. Chloe's father stepped forward, confident and composed, the kind of man who understood exactly how to hold a room without ever raising his voice. His words were warm, carefully chosen, filled with admiration for his daughter, her accomplishments, her grace, her ability to bring people together. The guests responded as expected, nodding, smiling, offering soft laughter at the appropriate moments. I listened without interruption, my expression unchanged, though each sentence seemed to reinforce something I had already begun to understand. When he spoke about family, about trust, about the future being built on strong foundations, I noticed the way his gaze moved briefly in my direction before shifting away again, as if acknowledging something without wanting to linger on it. It was subtle, but it was there. After him came Daniel's best man, then a close friend of Chloe's, each speech layered with praise, stories, and gentle humor. The room responded in waves, applause rising and falling, glasses lifted in celebration. From the outside, it was flawless, seamless, exactly as it should be. But beneath that surface, I could feel the tension building, not in the room itself, but within the quiet understanding I carried. Every word about loyalty, about honesty, about unity, echoed differently for me now. They no longer sounded like ideals. They sounded like contradictions. I shifted slightly in my chair, just enough to ease the stillness in my shoulders, and let my eyes move once more across the room. Daniel stood near the edge of the dance floor, listening, smiling when expected, but there was a tightness around his eyes that had not been there before. It was the same expression he used to have as a child when he knew he had done something wrong, but had not yet decided whether to admit it. That memory surfaced without effort, clear and precise, reminding me of how easily we believe people change when in truth, they simply learn to hide things better. Chloe, on the other hand, seemed entirely at ease, her posture relaxed, her attention focused on the speaker, her smile unwavering. She clapped at the right moments, leaned in to whisper brief comments to those seated near her, maintaining the image she had crafted so carefully. It was almost impressive, the consistency of it, the control. Almost. The master of ceremonies returned once more, his voice warm as he introduced the next part of the evening. There was a slight pause, just long enough to build anticipation, before he spoke my name. For a fraction of a second, the room seemed to hold its breath. I rose slowly, smoothing the fabric of my dress with a simple, practiced gesture, and stepped away from the table. The path to the front of the room felt longer than it was, each step measured, steady, unhurried. I could feel the weight of attention shift toward me, curious, expectant, uncertain. Some faces held polite interest. Others held something closer to concern. I did not rush. I did not hesitate. When I reached the microphone, I adjusted it slightly, bringing it to the right height, and allowed a brief moment of silence to settle before I spoke. Not because I needed the time, but because silence, when used well, can say more than words ever could. I looked out at the room, at the guests, at my son, and finally at Chloe, and offered the same calm, composed smile I had worn all evening. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. And so was I. I let my gaze rest on the crowd for just a moment longer before I spoke, allowing the silence to stretch just enough to draw them in, not with force, but with presence. Thank you. I began, my voice steady, measured, carrying easily through the room without needing to rise. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Daniel and Chloe. A few heads nodded, a few polite smiles returned, the atmosphere settling into what everyone expected this moment to be. A simple speech. A proud mother. Nothing more. I kept my hands lightly resting on the sides of the podium, my posture relaxed, my expression calm. Weddings, I continued, have always meant something very special to me. Not just because of the celebration, or the beauty, or even the promise of a future, but because they remind us of everything that came before. The years that shaped us. The people who stood beside us when no one else did. I paused briefly, letting my eyes move toward Daniel, just for a second. I remember when Daniel was 5 years old, I said softly, and he insisted on building a treehouse in our backyard. We did not have the money for it at the time, but he had that look in his eyes, the kind that does not accept no for an answer. So I worked extra shifts that summer. Long days, longer nights, and by the end of it, we built that treehouse together. A few gentle laughs moved through the room, the kind that comes with shared nostalgia, even from those who had never been there. I allowed a small smile to form, just enough to match the tone. It was not perfect, I added, but it was ours, and he loved it. I let that settle for a moment before continuing, my voice never changing, never sharpening, only carrying forward. That is what family is, or at least, what I always believed it to be. Showing up, even when it is difficult, even when no one is watching. Especially when no one is watching. The room had grown quieter now, not out of discomfort yet, but out of attention. People were listening more closely, though they might not have realized why. Over the years, I said, I have learned that not everyone sees family the same way. For some, it is about presence. For others, it becomes something more transactional. I did not rush the word. I let it land gently, without emphasis, without accusation. Just a statement. My eyes moved briefly across the tables, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the slight narrowing of attention. I have also learned that decisions are sometimes made quietly, behind closed doors, without including the very people they affect the most. I could feel it now, that faint tension threading through the room, not yet visible, but present. And I understand that. Truly I do. Life is complicated. People grow. Priorities change. I paused again, my fingers lightly adjusting the edge of the microphone, a small, deliberate movement. But what I find most interesting, I continued, my tone still calm, still composed, is not that these decisions are made. It is the assumption that they will go unnoticed. That was the moment the room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. I turned my gaze fully toward Daniel now, holding it just long enough for him to feel it, before allowing it to move to Chloe. Her smile had not disappeared, but it had changed, just slightly, just enough to reveal the first hint of uncertainty. I let a small, polite smile return to my lips. I have always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, I said softly, in trusting that those closest to me would speak honestly, act with integrity, and remember the foundation that brought them to where they are today. I straightened slightly, not as a show of authority, but as a quiet acknowledgement of what was coming next. So tonight, I added, my voice as steady as it had been from the beginning, I thought it might be a good time to share something that perhaps not everyone here is aware of. The silence that followed was no longer comfortable. And that, I knew, was exactly where the truth begins to take shape. The silence settled deeper now, no longer soft or expectant, but tense, like a thread pulled just a little too tight. I let it remain for a moment, allowing the weight of what I had just said to fully reach the room before I continued. A few weeks ago, I said calmly, I received a phone call, unexpected, from someone who had worked with my late husband for many years. I could feel the attention sharpen, the subtle shift as curiosity began to replace comfort. He reached out not out of obligation, but out of respect. Respect for a man who believed in doing things the right way, even when no one was looking. I paused briefly, my gaze steady, my tone unchanged. During that conversation, he mentioned something I found interesting. He asked if I was aware that discussions had been taking place regarding my property. I did not emphasize the words. I did not need to. They carried their own weight. Around the room, I noticed the small reactions beginning to surface. A glance exchanged between guests. A shift in posture. The quiet awareness that this was no longer a simple wedding speech. I told him I was not aware. I continued. Because I was not. No one had spoken to me. No one had asked. And yet, decisions were already being considered. I let my eyes move briefly toward Daniel, then Chloe, not lingering long enough to accuse, but long enough to acknowledge. Now, I understand that life moves quickly, I said, my voice still even, still composed. That plans are made, sometimes out of excitement, sometimes out of ambition. That is not what concerns me. I placed one hand lightly against the podium, grounding the moment. What concerns me, I added, is when those plans involve rewriting something that does not belong to you. The room had gone completely still. Even the servers along the edges had paused, as if uncertain whether to continue moving or remain unseen. The house that has been mentioned in those conversations, I said, was not simply a piece of property. It was built over decades. It carries the memory of every sacrifice, every long night, every choice made to ensure that my son would have opportunities one did not. My voice did not waver. It did not need to. And while it may appear, on paper, to be something that can be transferred, sold, or repurposed, there is one detail that was never discussed openly. I reached into my small clutch, slowly, deliberately, and removed a folded document. The sound of the paper was soft, but in that silence, it might as well have been thunder. Years ago, I said, holding the document lightly in my hand, my husband and I made a decision. Not out of fear, not out of distrust, but out of understanding. We understood that circumstances change, and that sometimes intentions do not remain as pure as they once were. I allowed a small pause, just long enough for the implication to settle without being forced. So we placed a condition, I continued. A very simple one. My eyes lifted again, meeting Chloe's for just a brief second before returning to the room. The ownership of that home, I said clearly, cannot be transferred, sold, or altered in any way unless I personally approve it. Not suggested. Not assumed. Approved. I let the words rest there, complete, unhurried. And any attempt to do otherwise, I added gently, renders the entire agreement invalid. The silence that followed was no longer subtle. It was absolute. I folded the document carefully, placing it back into my clutch with the same steady motion. I thought, I said softly, a faint, almost polite smile returning, that it would be important for everyone to understand that before we continue celebrating this beautiful evening. I stepped back slightly from the microphone, not as a retreat, but as a conclusion, leaving the truth exactly where it belonged, in the open, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. For a moment, no one moved. The kind of stillness that does not belong in a celebration settled over the room. Heavy and unmistakable. I stepped away from the microphone with the same calm precision I had approached it, my heels making soft, measured sounds against the polished floor as I returned to my seat. I did not rush. I did not look back. I simply walked, aware of every pair of eyes following me now, not with curiosity, but with a new understanding. When I reached my chair, I adjusted it slightly and sat down, smoothing the fabric of my dress once more as if nothing unusual had occurred. Across the room, the master of ceremonies hesitated, his practiced smile faltering for just a second before he attempted to recover, his voice returning in a slightly higher pitch as he thanked me and moved quickly to the next part of the program. But the rhythm had been broken. The carefully choreographed flow of the evening no longer felt seamless. It felt fragile. I lifted my glass again, not to drink, but to give my hands something to do as I observed what followed. Chloe was the first to react, though she tried to hide it. Her posture remained upright, her smile still in place, but it had tightened, the edges no longer soft. She leaned toward Daniel, her lips moving quickly, her voice too low for others to hear, but the urgency in her expression was clear. Daniel's response was slower. He blinked once, then again, as if processing something that did not fit into the version of events he had accepted. His gaze shifted toward me, just briefly this time, And there it was again, that familiar look from years ago. Not defiance, not anger, uncertainty. The kind that comes when the ground beneath you is not as stable as you believed. Around them, the guests began to stir, subtle at first. A chair adjusted, a whisper exchanged, a glance that lingered just a second longer than politeness allowed. The illusion of perfection had not shattered, but it had cracked, and cracks have a way of spreading. Chloe straightened slightly, her shoulders lifting as she regained control of her expression. She reached for Daniel's hand, holding it a little tighter than before, her smile returning with effort. To anyone not paying close attention, it might have looked the same, but it was not. Not anymore. I let my gaze move across the room, taking in the small changes. Chloe's parents were no longer as relaxed as they had been earlier. Their conversation had stopped, replaced by quiet observation. A few guests looked down at their plates, unsure where to direct their attention. Others watched openly now, curiosity no longer disguised. I rested my hands lightly on the table, my posture composed, my breathing steady. There was no need for further explanation. The truth, once spoken, does not require repetition. It simply exists, settling into the space around it, changing everything without needing to raise its voice. The band began to play again, though softer this time, as if uncertain whether it should fill the silence or respect it. The master of ceremonies continued, moving forward with the program, but his words felt less anchored, less certain. And yet, the evening did not stop. It never does. Events like this have momentum, and momentum carries them forward even when the atmosphere has shifted. Chloe turned her head slightly, her eyes finding me across the room. For the first time that night, she did not smile. It was brief, just a second, but it was enough. I met her gaze calmly, offering nothing in return but quiet acknowledgement. No challenge, no apology, just the understanding that the balance had changed. Daniel followed her line of sight, his expression more open now, more exposed. He did not look away as quickly this time. Instead, he held my gaze for a moment longer, as if searching for something he had not realized he needed. I gave him nothing more than the same composed expression I had maintained all evening. Because this was not a moment for reassurance. This was a moment for clarity. I reached for my napkin, adjusting it neatly beside my plate, a small, deliberate action that grounded the moment. Around me, the reception continued, but it no longer felt the same. And neither did they. The evening attempted to regain its rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be smoothed over with music or polite conversation. I remained seated, observing quietly as the program continued, though now every movement carried a different weight. The laughter that followed sounded slightly forced, just a fraction too loud, as if people were trying to convince themselves that everything was still as it should be. It never works that way. Once a truth has been spoken, even gently, it settles into the room and refuses to leave. Chloe rose again not long after, guided back toward the center for the next sequence of the evening, her posture still elegant, her chin lifted just enough to project confidence. She knew how to perform, and she was not about to let a single moment unravel the image she had spent months building. Daniel stood beside her, but this time there was a slight hesitation in his movements, a pause that had not been there before, as though he was no longer entirely certain where to place himself. I noticed the way his hand hovered for a second before resting at his side, instead of reaching for hers. Small things. But small things are where the truth lives. The master of ceremonies continued with practiced enthusiasm, announcing the next dance, inviting the guests to join, encouraging celebration. Slowly, the floor began to fill again, couples stepping forward, music rising just a little louder, as if volume alone could restore what had been lost. I watched as Chloe moved among them, greeting guests, accepting compliments, her smile returning with careful precision. To most, it would have looked the same. But I could see the calculation behind it now, the slight delay before each expression, the way her eyes scanned the room more often than before, checking, measuring, adjusting. Control is easy to maintain when nothing challenges it. It becomes much harder when the narrative begins to slip. At one point, she approached my table, her steps measured, her expression composed. She stopped just beside me, close enough that only I could hear her voice when she spoke. "That was unnecessary," she said softly, her tone controlled, but no longer light. I turned my head slightly to meet her gaze, my expression unchanged. "So was your comment," I replied, just as quietly. There was no edge in my voice, no raised tone, just a simple acknowledgement. She held my gaze for a second longer, searching perhaps for something she could use, something she could challenge, but there was nothing there for her to take. Calm leaves very little room for attack. She straightened, her smile returning as she turned away, rejoining the flow of the evening as if the exchange had never happened. Daniel lingered a few steps behind her, his eyes moving between us, his expression more unsettled now, more aware. He took a step toward me, then stopped, as if uncertain whether to speak. For a moment, I thought he might. Instead, he gave a small, almost automatic nod and followed his wife back into the crowd. I did not call after him. Some realizations cannot be guided. They must arrive on their own. I rested my hands once more on the table, my posture steady, my attention returning to the room as a whole. Conversations had resumed, but they carried a different tone now, quieter, more careful. The celebration continued, but the illusion of complete control had dissolved, replaced by something more honest, more fragile. And as I sat there, watching it all unfold, I understood that this was not the end of anything. It was simply the moment everything began to reveal itself. The night moved forward, as it always does, carried by music and polite conversations, but the energy never fully returned to what it had been before. Something quieter had taken its place, something more aware. I remained at my table for a while longer, watching as guests continued to dance, to talk, to smile in ways that were now just a little more careful. It was not dramatic. It was not loud, but it was real, and that was enough. After some time, I rose from my chair, smoothing the fabric of my dress once more, the same small gesture I had repeated throughout the evening, not out of habit, but out of intention. Composure is not something that appears on its own. It is maintained, choice by choice. I picked up my clutch, holding it lightly in my hand, and took one last look around the ballroom. The lights still glowed warm against the white and gold decor. The music still filled the space. The celebration still continued, but it no longer belonged to the illusion it had started with. It belonged to something more honest now. My gaze found Daniel one final time. He was standing near the edge of the dance floor, not fully engaged, not entirely withdrawn, caught somewhere in between. When he saw me standing, truly saw me this time, something in his expression shifted. He stepped toward me, slower than I had ever seen him move, as if each step required thought he had never needed before. "Mom," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the ease it had carried earlier in the evening. I stopped, giving him just enough of my attention to acknowledge him, but not enough to anchor him. "You could have told me," he added, a quiet attempt at reclaiming something he did not yet understand had already changed. I held his gaze for a moment, not unkindly, but without softening it either. "You could have asked," I replied, my voice calm, steady, leaving no room for confusion. There was no anger in it, no accusation, just clarity. He looked at me as if he wanted to say more, as if there were explanations forming somewhere beneath the surface, but none of them seemed ready to come forward. Chloe appeared a moment later, her presence still composed, still controlled, but no longer effortless. She did not speak this time. She simply stood beside him, her silence now carrying a different weight than mine had earlier in the evening. I gave them both a small, polite nod, the kind one offers at the end of a conversation, even when no real conversation has taken place. Then I turned and began to walk toward the exit. No one stopped me. No one called after me. The doors opened quietly, and the cool night air met me with a calm that felt almost unfamiliar after the warmth of the ballroom. Outside, the world was still. The distant hum of traffic, the soft glow of streetlights, the quiet rhythm of a night that had nothing to prove. I took a slow breath, allowing the silence to settle around me, not as emptiness, but as space. Space to think, space to stand, space to exist without being defined by anyone else's expectations. Behind me, the music continued, softened now by distance, fading with each step I took. I did not look back. Some chapters do not need a final glance to be complete. They end when you decide they do. I walked toward my car, my steps steady, my posture unchanged, carrying nothing with me except what had always been mine. Not the house, not the approval, not the illusion of belonging, just something far more valuable: understanding. Because in the end, respect is never something you are given by a room full of people. It is something you choose to keep, even when the room turns against you. And that, I had done without saying a single unnecessary word.